Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava Metzia, page 117. Top of the page with the words Kishahu Dar, Levado Hu Dar, Kide Meikara, etc. With regard to a resident of the upper story who is entitled to move into the lower story, when he resides there, does he reside alone, as he did at the outset, when he occupied the upper story, and the owner of the house has no choice but to move out? Or perhaps they both reside there together, as the owner can say to him, I did not rent the upper story to you with the intention of being removed from my domicile. If you say that they both reside there, where when the upper story resident uses the house, does he use it by way of its entrances, like the owner, or must he use it by way of the roofs? Must he climb the stairs and enter the upper story, and then descend to the house from there? Can the owner say, the tenant must act as he did at the outset, just as the outset he entered by way of the roofs, now too he must enter by way of the roofs? Or perhaps the renter can say to him, I accepted upon myself an assent and agreed to climb the stairs to the upper story, but I did not accept upon myself an ascent and a descent, which would be necessary if I entered by way of the roofs. If you say that the tenant can say to the owner, I did not accept upon myself an ascent and a descent in a case where there were two upper stories, this one on top of that one, what is the halacha? The Gemara clarifies the circumstances of this case. If the floor of the higher upper story was broken, clearly he may descend and reside in the lower one. But if the floor of the lower upper story was broken, what is the halacha? Is he required to ascend the full way and reside in the upper story? Or does he go down to reside on the ground floor? Do we say that the owner of the house can say to the tenant, you accepted upon yourself the term an upper story, and I have provided one for you? Or perhaps one says that the tenant accepted upon himself one ascent, but he did not accept upon himself two ascents. No answer was found to these questions, and the Gemara concludes, Teiku. These dilemmas shall stand unresolved. And according to the book called Teiku, Sofer, written by Rabbi Aaron Pessin of Ramat Beit Shemesh, wrote a Sofer about all the Teikus. This would be the 153rd Teiku. You accepted upon yourself the term an upper story. Interesting. This is the 153rd. If the floor of the higher upper story was broken, clearly he may descend. Something about, Anyway, further, weiter. The Mishnah teaches, Rabbi Yossi says, the lower resident provides the ceiling, and the upper resident provides the plaster. The Gemara asks, what is the word ceiling referring to in this context? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says mats and beams. And the sage Satini says that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says wide wooden planks. I wonder if Satini shows up in Shas at all. Satini. That's it. Mamash. Satini. I guess that's it. It might be the only time. Anyway, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says wide wooden planks. Think more comments. Let's see here. Satini. That's it. Okay, the Gemara comments, and these two opinions do not disagree over the basic halakha. Rather, this sage rules in accordance with the custom of his locale, and this sage in accordance with the custom of his locale. And they each were describing the necessary material for a ceiling according to the local building conventions. The Gemara relates, an incident occurred with these two people who were residing in the same house, one in the upper story and the other one in the lower story. The plaster of the floor of the upper story broke, so that when the resident of the upper apartment would wash with water, it would run down and cause damage to the lower story. The question was, who must repair the ceiling? Rabbi Chia bar Abba says the upper resident repairs it, and Rabbi Eli says, in the name of Rabbi Chia, the son of Rabbi Yossi, the lower resident repairs it. The Gemara comments, and the following verse can serve as a mnemonic device to remember who issued which ruling. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt. Genesis 39:1. Rabbi Chia, the son of Rabbi Yossi, indicated by Joseph, is the sage who maintains that the owner of the lower story, indicated by brought down, must repair the ceiling. The Gemara suggests, shall we say that Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Eli disagree with regard to the matter subject to dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis in the Mishnah? The explanation of the dispute would then be as follows. According to the one who says that the upper resident repairs it, he holds that the responsibility is on the one potentially responsible for the damage to distance himself from the one whose property potentially damaged. This accounts for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah, who holds that the resident of the upper story must provide the plaster because his water is clearly causing damage below. And the one who says that the lower resident repairs it, he holds it like the rabbis who say that the responsibility is on the one whose property is potentially damaged to distance himself from the one potentially responsible for the damage. I don't know if distance. He's living there. He could have moved, maybe. I don't know. The Gemara asks, and how can you understand it that way? Do Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis disagree in the Mishnah with regard to distancing oneself from damages? But haven't we heard them say the opposite, as we learned in the Mishnah in Bava Basra 25b? One must distance a tree 25 cubits from a pit because its roots damage the pit, and in the case of a carob or sycamore tree whose roots spread far, one must distance it by 50 cubits. This is the halakha, whether the pit or tree is located above, or to the side, or to the other. If the pit preceded the tree, the owner of the pit may cut down the tree and pay its monetary value. If the tree preceded the pit, and he may not cut it down. if it is uncertain whether this tree preceded that pit, and it is uncertain whether that pit preceded this tree, he may not cut down the tree. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi says even if the pit preceded the tree, he may not cut it down. Why is that? As this one digs in his own property, and that one plants in his own property. Consequently, the owner of the pit cannot complain about the damage if he wants to avoid it, he can dig his pit elsewhere. Apparently, the Mishnah indicates that Rabbi Yossi holds that the responsibility is on the one whose property is potentially damaged to distance himself from the one potentially responsible for the damage. And the rabbis hold that the responsibility is on the one potentially responsible for the damage to distance himself from the one whose property is potentially damaged. Okay. Rather, if it can be said that these Amoraim disagree with regard to the issue that is the subject of the dispute between these Tanaim, that they disagree in the dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis there concerning the question of who is obligated to distance himself from the damage, but it has nothing to do with the dispute in the Mishnah here. The Gemara asked, and with regard to what principle do Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis of the Mishnah here disagree? The Gemara answers they disagree with regard to the strength of a ceiling. The rabbis hold that the function of the plaster is to strengthen the ceiling, and strengthening the ceiling is the obligation of the lower resident, as he is required to strengthen it. And Rabbi Yossi holds that the function of the plaster is to level out any holes so that the surface of the ceiling will be flat, and leveling out holes is the obligation of the upper resident, as he required to level them out. I think we will stop here. Oh, you know what? We don't have that much to go. Let's just finish it up. The Gemara challenges the above conclusion. Is that so? But did Rav Ashi say when I was in the school of Kahana, we would say that Rabbi Yossi concedes in the case of his arrows, although Rabbi Yossi holds that the responsibility is on the one whose property is potentially damaged to distance himself from the one potentially responsible for the damage. That is only if the one causing the damage is not performing a direct action that is causing the damage, as in the case of the tree and the pit. But if he is performing an action that causes damage from a distance, as in that case where the water he pours damages the residents of the lower story, he is like someone shooting arrows who is certainly obligated to ensure that he does not cause any damage. The Gemara answers that this is a case in which the water flow stops in one place, as the hole in the floor is not directly in the place where the water was poured. So substantially it falls into the lower story once it flows to the opening in the floor. Consequently, even in this case, the upper resident does not directly cause the damage. And that's the end of that. Mishnah, new Mishnah. And we're almost finished with this Amud here. In the case of the house, the upper story belonging to two different people. We're holding here. Okay. Belonging to different people. And that house, the upper story collapsed. The owner of the upper story told the owner of the house to build the lower story in order to enable him to rebuild the upper story, and he does not want to build it. The owner of the upper story may build the house and reside in it until the other gives him his expenses for the construction of the house, and then he rebuilds his upper story. Rabbi Yehuda says this one too, in other words, the owner of the upper story, who is meanwhile residing inside the property of the other, must pay him out, since he's derived benefit by living in the house of the other, as he had no other place in which he could live. He must pay rent. The solution is therefore flawed. Rather, the owner of the upper story builds the house and the upper story, and he roofs the upper story. If he completes the entire construction of the upper story, and he may then sit in the house, in other words, lower story, until the other gives him his expenses for the building of the house, at which point he returns to his upper study. Since in any event he could have lived in the upper story, he is not considered to have derived any benefit from living in the lower story and is not obligated to pay rent.